Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to the 2014 O.C. Hubert Lecture. I'm Elizabeth Quiche, the president of Agnes Scott. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this very, very special event. The O.C. Hubert Lecture was established in order to, and I want to quote this because it's very powerful language. It was established to bring to the Agnes Scott campus individuals whose dedication, energy, and idealism in working for the common good is exemplary and who have contributed in a significant and inspirational way to efforts to provide food to the hungry, medical attention to the sick, or spiritual fulfillment to those troubled in spirit. And I cannot think of a person more suited to be an O.C. Hubert lecturer than our lecturer this year, the wonderful Dr. Helene Gayle. This event is made possible by Dick and Linda Hubert, who have been extraordinary generous benefactors to Agnes Scott through their Hubert Scholars program for internships in public service, as well as supportive of public health efforts all around the world. And I'm delighted that Dick and Linda Hubert are here with us this evening. And so just take a moment. And for those of you who are students, you need to know that Dr. Linda Hubert is an alum and a faculty member and former administrator at Agnes Scott as well. So we're just delighted to welcome you back to Agnes Scott. This is also a number of firsts. This event represents a number of firsts. It is the first public event in this space, in this beautiful auditorium. So that's very exciting. The completely transformed Campbell Hall is it's actually going to be publicly dedicated on September 24th. So it hasn't even been dedicated yet, but we thought that this would be a wonderful event with which to launch the uses of this beautiful auditorium, which is the Frances Bailey Graves. We like to call it the Franny Auditorium, named for a wonderful alumna of Agnes Scott, a wonderful friend of Agnes Scott. It is also the inaugural event in what will be a multi-year series that we are calling LeaderStories. LeaderStories is part of Agnes Scott's new signature initiative, Summit. Through this initiative, which will be fully launched this coming fall, the fall of 2015, every Agnes Scott student, regardless of major, will have a robust four-year experience focused on global learning, on leadership development, and supported by a personalized board of advisors. This will make Agnes Scott absolutely unique among institutions of higher education for our focus on global learning and leadership development. And central to the vision for Summit is that we want Agnes Scott students to get a chance to get up close and personal with extraordinary leaders from many walks of life. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the two people who will be in conversation, because we decided that this year the O.C. Hubert Lecture should really be a conversation. So I'm delighted that my wonderful colleague, Dr. Amy Patterson, who is the chair of the Public Health Department here at Agnes Scott and an assistant professor of public health, will be the conversation partner for Dr. Gayle. Amy is a graduate of Williams College. She has graduate degrees from Johns Hopkins and Emory University. Prior to coming to Agnes Scott, she worked at the Carter Center, and her dissertation research was actually done in partnership with CARE. So, with CDC, excuse me. And her husband works with CARE, that's right. She is an expert in, much of her work has been on malaria. She's an expert on child development and child health in West Africa, and she has quickly become a wonderful leader and innovator for us here at Agnes Scott, and very much involved in the creation of the Summit program. So I'm delighted that Amy is a part of this program. And now it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Helene Gayle. Dr. Gayle, you all know, is the president and CEO of CARE, one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations. And speaking of firsts and trailblazers, she is the first woman, the first person of color, and the first physician to head CARE. CARE was founded back in the 1940s. And so that's quite an extraordinary record right there. She is, prior to coming to CARE, she spent 20 years at the CDC heading up their HIV/AIDS program. She also spent time in leading the HIV/AIDS initiative at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is a proud Women's College graduate, a graduate of Barnard College, and has her MPH from Johns Hopkins, like Amy, and her medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. She is a very influential leader all around the world. She is on the boards of many organizations, including the Coca-Cola Company, the One Campaign, Colgate-Palmolive. She is on the President's Commission on White House Fellowships, and was recently named one of Forbes magazine's 100 most powerful women in the world. One of the few, actually, on that list who is involved in humanitarian work. And so that's something that we're very proud of Dr. Gayle. And last but certainly not least, she is a Scottie. She has an honorary degree from Agnes Scott College in 2009, one of many honorary degrees, but one that is especially meaningful for all of us here at Agnes Scott. And I know that Dr. Gayle has watched with great interest the development of our public health program and our summit initiative.
I'm still waiting to get that black...
The black ring! Okay, it can be arranged.
Part of the black ring mafia, you know?
Exactly, exactly. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Patterson and our O.C. Hubert lecturer, Dr. Helene Gayle.
I see a number of public health majors and students in the audience. I thought that I would begin, since many of them are thinking about where they're headed from here and careers, by asking you about how much your career path has resembled what you imagined for yourself when you were the age of these students.
Well, first, let me say how wonderful it is to be here, and I'm really honored to be the first in this series. It's great, and to be the first in this hall, this lovely space, and to be here with the Huberts. It's really my honor and real pleasure. You all have done so much, not only for Agnes Scott, but here in Atlanta in general and around the world, to really make a difference in public health. And I, just hope you know what a legacy you're leaving in terms of making this issue of public health, and particularly global public health, such an important part of your own, key priorities. So just it's wonderful to be here. As I've always said about my career, nothing has been planned. And I, when people come and ask me about, how do you become, the leader of a global philanthropy or somebody who has a long-standing career in public health, they want to know, what courses should I take? What should I do next? And what's the road? And, I always say, there is no magic, right, exact path, and the best thing to do is to follow your passion, and and to have some overarching philosophy about what's important to you in life, and that's really all that's ever guided me. I didn't, I went to college not even thinking that I was going to go to medical school. That came because I wanted to do something that I felt would make a contribution to society, and one thing led to the next, and I ended up in medical school. I ended up going to public health because I had always wanted to make sure that what I did had the biggest impact on the largest number of people. Medicine is the practice of taking care of individuals. Public health is the practice of taking care of communities and societies. So for me, public health started making sense because it was the way of having the greatest impact on the largest number of people. But I didn't do that because I started at age 18 knowing what I wanted to do. So, I think my career has been one of being willing to take risks, doing things that weren't necessarily a straight line linear path. My residency was in pediatrics, so I started out as a clinician in pediatrics, but then came to the Centers for Disease Control thinking I would come for a couple of years in their epidemiology training program, came for 2 years, stayed 20. So it's just an example of how you really never can predict what you're going to do. I remember when I first, and it was Bill Foege who was at the Gates Foundation who started talking to me about coming to the Gates Foundation when I was at CDC. I'd been in CDC and in the government, thought that was the center of the universe, the idea of moving to Seattle on the other coast of the country was the furthest thing from my mind. But, when he came to me, Bill Foege, for those who don't know, he is one of the leaders of the eradication of smallpox effort, and he was the director of the Centers for Disease Control when I first came in. Anyway, a legendary hero in public health. He went to the Gates Foundation, started talking to me about that. That was the furthest thing from my mind, but began to understand what an incredible potential the Gates Foundation would have as this new foundation philanthropy based on the richest two people in the world, the impact that was going to have for public health. So I went to the Gates Foundation totally without knowing what I was getting myself into. So, I could go on and on about the different ways in which I have followed things that were not necessarily on the prescribed path, but I think that's, to me, the biggest lesson in all is be open to the unexpected, but know what your overarching guiding principle is and follow your passion.
Nice for me to hear that. I try to tell the students it doesn't matter so much. Every single class you take is not going to determine your career for the rest of your life, but it's nice to hear it from others as well. So you mentioned the number of major organizations that you've worked with, CDC, Gates Foundation, and now CARE. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the specific leadership opportunities and challenges at each of those places.
Well, as you said, each of them have been different. And, I spent more years at CDC than any other place. And, I came in as a trainee in the epidemiology training program. And I still remember coming in from leaving residency where every moment of your day is prescribed. You have a beeper and you cannot get out of range of that beeper. You are called for everything. You are told exactly what schedule, how many weeks you're going to be doing, any particular rotation. And, I came to CDC and everything was kind of open. I remember my supervisor then giving me a project and I said, well, so what is exactly I'm supposed to do? He said, I don't know, you have to figure it out. And it was the first time in my career where I actually had to think about, all right, what's the question? How do you decide how you want to go about examining a particular question? And nobody has the right answer. It's really up to you. And so, my first leadership challenge there was to get comfortable with ambiguity and accept the fact that it really was up to me to decide both the question as well as the answer, and get comfortable with that. And I'm sure a lot of you who are doing research projects have that opportunity to think about that in the classroom experience, but that was my first kind of professional experience of doing that. And I remember, just even leaving my desk and knowing that there was nobody who was going to call me, there was no beeper, there was nothing that was going to necessarily, prescribe what my day was like. So I think, having that opportunity to just get comfortable with the flexibility and the freedom that comes with being able to examine questions and think about where you want to take things. I continued to rise up the ranks at CDC, and I think one of the early challenges for me was that I was oftentimes in situations where I became the supervisor of people who had been my peers, and I subsequently became the supervisor of people who had been my supervisor's supervisors. And I think, it's something that we, as you go through your career, and I think particularly as women, learning how to become comfortable with leadership roles where you have people who used to be peers or even people who used to be supervisors to you, and how do you get comfortable with that and really recognize the fact that on one hand you're still you, shouldn't necessarily change who you are and the way you are as a person, and but at the same time you have a responsibility to an organization, and that responsibility is a leadership responsibility and just, kind of getting comfortable with that. When I went to the Gates Foundation, it was interesting. I came from the largest center at CDC. I was the head of the largest center at the time, CDC, that was HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, and tuberculosis. And, we had 1,000 or so employees all around the world, $1 billion budget. And I went to the Gates Foundation, and I was my own division. I quickly hired an assistant. It was me and my assistant. At that time, the global health program was 10 people who could fit around a table. It's now 300, 400 people. But it was a very interesting challenge to grow a organization and a program from one person, myself, to what is now a very large program at the Gates Foundation. So learning all those skills of how do you develop a program, how do you put systems in place, and how do you work to convince people of develop strategies for programs. And then came to CARE, where I'm now the head of a large international organization. First time I'd been a CEO. And there is, people talk about it's lonely at the top and all these sort of things, that when you have the head job of an organization, and it is truly a real challenge when you know that in some ways the buck stops with you, and learning how to get comfortable with being the leader of an organization, but at the same time not losing touch with the people within your organization, because you're in a bit of a bubble when you're CEO, president. Yeah, I know you can relate to this. You're in a little bit of a bubble. People tell you what they want you to hear. You've got to be able to make sure that you keep close to enough to the rank and file and actually understand what's going on in your organization, so that you aren't out of touch and that you make decisions that are actually in touch with the reality. But at the same time, you do have to have a certain amount of distance, because you make hard decisions. And I think that's the biggest challenge of leadership, is that in some ways, you have to make really hard decisions, oftentimes about people who you care very deeply about, but you've always got to have that split between what's in the best interest of the organization and how that affects individuals, and constantly trying to make that balance of what's the best decisions to keep your organization healthy, even though sometimes those decisions are tough individual and people decisions.
I want to follow up a little bit on that last point. And so when you took over, the helm at CARE in 2006, you introduced quite a number of major changes in the mission and the focus of the organization. And my sense is that there may have been some people who were resistant to that coming in. It was a major change. So how did you work with people who were maybe not fully on board with the changes?
So I think one of the things you're probably talking about is the focus on girls and women. And one of the good things and also the challenging things when you take over an organization that has been around, CARE has been around for 70 years. So when I took it over, it was just over 60 years. It's an organization that has a great legacy, great history, started after World War II, giving out care packages, and evolved from there to an organization that focuses on global poverty around the world. And you have both the challenge of trying to make the organization relevant for today's world and today's challenges, but at the same time, you don't want to screw it up and wreck, what has been a long-standing institution. And so it's a real delicate balance. How much change do you introduce? How much do you keep the legacy and the history of a great organization? And luckily, in many ways, the evolution that CARE went through, which did put a huge focus on girls and women, was one that was almost a natural. If you look at global poverty, we know that girls and women are disproportionately impacted by poverty. If you look at health, education, income, et cetera, around the world in poorest communities, girls and women bear the brunt of poverty. But there's also incredible evidence that shows that if you invest in a girl, you have an intergenerational impact on poverty. A girl who's educated is more likely to marry later, have fewer children, earn an income herself, contribute to her family. Women who have an income are more likely to put that extra income into families, into communities in ways that men aren't. And so, we know that the impact of investing in girls and women is great. So I wasn't the genius who created this. It was very clear, and we were on that path. On the other hand, as an organization that is 70 years old, there were a lot of people, both in the organization as well as our incredibly generous donor community, that weren't comfortable. I mean, I got asked, particularly in the early days, are you changing this into some kind of radical feminist organization? And, and while there are those who would say yay, there are many who saw that as a challenge. And if you think about it, I mean, we know that gender equality isn't, what it should be here in the United States. But for the average person in the United States, it isn't always obvious how incredibly difficult it is to be a woman in other parts of the world. Relatively speaking, yes, we still have things that we've got to figure out here, but relatively speaking, we have a certain amount of understanding of women's role in our society. Yes, if you look at a lot of statistics, we still have fewer women in leadership roles than we should. We still don't have economic parity in jobs. There are issues that we still have to tackle. But when you talk about what happens to women in the countries that we live in, they're prisoners. They're not able to leave their homes. They are married off at age 13. They are beaten by their husbands for getting dinner on the table late. They're not able to pursue a career. If you look at the realistic statistics about women around the world. And so, I used to laugh and say, oftentimes our men donors who were very upset about this kind of focus on girls and women, I said, we're not talking about your ex-wife who's suing you for alimony. We're talking about women who are beaten routinely because their husband come home angry. We're talking about women who are married off at age 12 and 13 and have fistulas because they had children too early and their bodies were immature. We're talking about very different circumstances than what you may be, angry about. So let's look at what we're talking about. And we're also talking about how do we change society so that men and boys also gain as a result of the fact that women are more empowered. And one of the most powerful things that I've seen are some of our programs at the community level where village savings and loans are a good example of that, where women, once they're able to earn an income, are seen as valuable to their husbands, and their husbands actually feel like finally they get a partner. They don't have somebody who's a burden. They have somebody who's actually an active partner in their relationship. And so it's not that girls and women are the only ones who benefit. Boys and men are part of the equation as well. And so it isn't about excluding boys and men. It's how do we bring greater parity? How do we bring more equal societies? And how do we build a world where girls and women are able to realize their full potential in ways that have impact, not beyond just them, but also have impact on the whole society?
So you mentioned the savings and loan programs. I'm wondering if you could talk about a few other strategies that CARE is using to improve the situation of women and deliver lasting change.
Well, I think we can name any of the issues. Agriculture is one that I think is incredibly exciting. In many of the areas that we work in, we're working with rural agrarian societies. In much of the developing world, agriculture is still the leading way in which people make a living and have economic viability. But oftentimes women are left out of that equation. They don't have access to income to take out loans for things like fertilizers or equipment. They don't have access to the best seeds to produce crops. And so we've had several programs, in fact, one large program funded by the Gates Foundation, that has allowed us to work on ways to give women the same access to inputs that men have in farming. And it's been hugely successful and one way in which women have been greatly empowered. We're doing that in a variety of different ways. And agriculture is not just planting things, but it's also things like taking care of livestock. I went to a project that I still always remember in Egypt, where we're working with Danone, the yogurt, the French company that produces yogurt. And they have a program that has developed a community milk collection site where women who oftentimes are the ones who have 1 or 2 cows in their household. And I went to this place where I visited where a woman had her cow in her the back room. It was a one-room house. She had this cow. She took the cow to this community collection center and was part of this center that was able to develop pasteurization. Her cow contributed to a community center that then became the national milk supply that became part of Danone's supply chain. So, this one woman with 1 cow became part of helping to supply milk for the whole country. And it started out, I think, when it first started out, I think it was like 5% of their milk supply. It's now about 25% of their milk supply, and they're expecting that it's going to be one of the largest suppliers for their milk nationally in Egypt. And that's this one little woman with this cow. We were able to teach her things like how to make sure the cow gets enough milk, what's the right food, how do you improve your milk yield so that she can have a reasonable, consistent source of income. And she said, well, before Danone came and before Karen Danone had this project, we would take our milk to a collection site where, depending on what the supply and demand was, we had no idea what our income was going to be. It was very precarious. We know they cheated us. We know that they, gave us prices based on, whatever they wanted to give. Now she had a steady income stream. So those are the kinds of things that make me feel incredibly, optimistic about the future of this world.
So a lot of the students in this room, we hope, will go on to be leaders in global health, potentially. What do you see as the major opportunities and challenges for leadership in global health in the next, let's see, where are you? Graduation in maybe 4 years, next maybe 5 to 10 years?
First of all, I think the issues will shift. When I went into health and global health, we were primarily focused on infectious diseases, and a lot of my career is part of my introduction was on HIV/AIDS. That was, at the time that I came to CDC, it was the defining public health issue of our time, and became more and more a huge impact on global health efforts. Infectious diseases, whether it's measles or malaria, tuberculosis, have always been really a huge part of what we focused on in global health. Increasingly, I think chronic diseases are going to be shaping the global health landscape. And I think as more and more countries go through this transition from what we consider to be traditional global health issues of infectious diseases to more of the lifestyle diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, et cetera. India now has probably the highest diabetes rates in the world because of the high intake of sweets and sugar. So, I think more and more chronic diseases are going to become part of the landscape. And I think, looking at that, mental health and mental illness, depression is, I think, now considered one of the top 5 causes of morbidity around the world. So I think thinking much more broadly about what does it mean as societies shift, and how do we get on top of those issues? Because in many of these countries, they're still going to have the same infectious disease challenges and traditional global health challenges that we've talked about, at the same time that some of these lifestyle more behaviorally linked issues are going to be taking higher priority. So I think it's really thinking about how to get on top of that as quickly as possible. And we obviously haven't done a great job here, so there's a lot to focus on. And I think it does mean that policy issues are going to also be more important. We look at the issue of tobacco, for instance, and how tobacco has been exported to countries around the world. When I was in China not too long ago, one of the biggest challenges, tobacco is a major source of income for poor rural people in China. And public health officials are really challenged. On one hand, they know that growing tobacco as a major crop, which means there's huge tobacco usage as well, is a major public health challenge. On the other hand, it's also a huge source of income. So I think these whole grappling with the policy issues that go along with some of the issues that we think of as just health care issues, we need to think about how do we do a better job of that. I think the other challenge is going to be that that it is great that compared to when I first entered into global health, you needed European and American technical people because there wasn't the capacity in the countries in which we were working. Today, I can go into most of the countries that I work in and have counterparts from those countries. And, what I often face when I'm talking to young people who all want to go and work in global health or global development or whatever, it's a changing landscape when the people in those countries are actually able to do for themselves. It's what we wanted. We wanted that day when the capacity is actually there, it's homegrown, it's relevant, it's indigenous to the countries in which we work. But it does mean that we have to figure out what's the right career path for young Americans, young Europeans or others who still want to be relevant and contribute beyond themselves. And one of the things I think that we need to do a better job of is recognizing that the skills you learn in global health are very relevant to the United States. And global health, we are part of, it's no longer international health, it's no longer the people over there, it's global health. It's also about us, it's also about rural America, it's about the pockets of poverty that we have here. So I think we need to expand our notion of global health and recognize that, yes, it is important to think about how we're giving to people around the globe, but how are we using those things, not even across town. When we were driving over here, there's pockets right next door to this college that are pockets of poverty. And so I think we've got to be thinking about that a lot more as well and extending our notion of global health to thinking about how do we also take those lessons back to build greater equity and reduce inequity here in this country.
So in thinking about that, and you're talking about working with these countries and your counterparts in other countries, and we're seeing a growing emphasis on partnership in the global health world, and your website mentions you love your partners on there.
Most of them.
Most of them.
Some I like to strangle from time to time, but anyway, yeah.
So I'm curious about how you lead in that kind of a context where there's an emphasis on partnership, there's an emphasis on autonomy, but then you also want a shared strategy and vision and global goals.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because I think partnership, we all talk about partnership and we throw the word around a lot. I really learned that when I was at CDC, and I think it was a great lesson from my years at CDC. We, as a federal agency, most of our resources actually went through state health departments. And we had to learn how to come in when there was an outbreak or work with health departments in ways that didn't overshadow them and really let them lead. And, it's this whole notion of how do you lead from behind? How do you really look at providing capacity, helping to build capacity, but in ways that, let others lead when that's the right thing, lead when it's right for you to lead, and also learn how to build on each other's differences as opposed to each other's similarities. So, when traditionally CARE has partnered a lot with organizations like us, other NGOs, other development organizations. And increasingly, we're looking at how do we partner with organizations that are less like us, where there's greater complementarity. The private sector is one. We've really started doing lots more with private corporations and the private sector. And it's, it takes time, and it takes developing real trust and the ability even to speak your own language. I often use this example in, again, back to our village savings and loans. I was with one of our corporate partners who's helping us to look at how do we take these village savings and loans programs where most of them are poor women and men who don't have access to formal financial institutions, banks, and developing a way for them to get their resources into banks. And we're using mobile payments and all sort of different ways that people who wouldn't have access to financial institutions are able to do that. And he said, I've been talking to my colleagues for a long time about this project. I'm excited about it. I love the idea of financial inclusion. But he said, I talked for years to my colleagues about financial inclusion, and their eyes glazed over. But when I said future customers, all of a sudden, they got it. And so I think, it's how do we build that sort of language? How do we talk to each other so that we know what others' drivers are, and we can talk the same language and come together in ways that build on something, the things that we don't have, because we're much better if we can extend, and leverage each other, but do that in ways that isn't duplicative, but actually builds on the ways in which we can complement each other.
So is there a sense in that scenario that someone is driving the agenda, or is it really a shared democratic process and partnership?
Well, I hope who's driving the agenda are the people we serve. And so, if at the end of the day, it's around setting goals, being very clear about what your goals are, what do you want to accomplish, and doing that to benefit the people whose lives we want to make a difference. It's not my agenda. It's not CARE's agenda. It's that woman, in rural Malawi or whatever. That's the agenda that I hope we serve. And if we can develop goals that are tangible around that, then I think we all benefit.
So President Quiche wanted me to ask you, if you could have one superpower, what would it be? And then the public health pragmatist in me wants to know, in the absence of that superpower, what do you do to get the same things done?
A superpower. I guess it would be more hours in a day. But maybe that's a bad thing to wish for. Time management. When you're working in, and I often say the great thing about the jobs and the things that I've been able to do is that they are absolutely synced with who I am as a person. They are absolutely in the, square in the bullseye of my areas of passion. It's also the bad thing, because then you don't draw the line. If I was working if I was a factory worker putting together widgets, I would be very clear that at 5 o'clock, I am done with that and I go home. When you are doing things that you love and that are a part of who you are as a person, it's a lot harder to draw those lines. And it is a challenge, and we all talk about this, mythical work-life balance thing that I don't think anybody, if anybody has ever found that, raise your hand and we'll give you lots of millions of dollars. But I think it's, it is about how do you really take as seriously who you are as a whole person, and try to think about how you do that in a way that doesn't, sacrifice other parts of your life, and and pay as much attention to that as we do to how we think about our career and our career paths and planning our careers. And so, I think if I had superpowers, I'd figure out how to have work-life balance and maybe how to have more hours in a day. But I think if I had more hours in a day, I'd probably just continue to work more. So that's probably not what I should ask for. So anyway.
I think we'll open the floor to students for questions, but I just wanted to ask if you had any last advice about future leaders and techniques and strategies for leadership?
There's been a lot said about leadership, And I have made all the mistakes that anybody makes in one's leadership journey and probably more. And I guess I would just say at the end of the day, leadership is about finding out who you are and being true to that. And at the end of the day, everybody talks about authenticity as perhaps being the greatest trait to a leader. There is no one way to be a leader. There is, it's not whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. It's not whether you're a great communicator or a poor communicator, or if you've got great vision, or if there are all these traits and aspects that I think people can develop. And, there's so much of leadership that is teachable. And I remember when I was growing up, people always talked about born leaders, that, you have to be born to be a leader. And it's, just isn't true. I mean, people take on leadership roles at all levels of life and career and all the rest of it. But I think the one thing that nobody can teach you is to be true to yourself and to be authentic. And I think that's one of the hardest things, particularly early on in a leadership journey. And I think it's often, it might be even more so for women who are oftentimes used to wanting to please others and to be what people expect you to be. And I think the sooner you get comfortable with who you are and recognize that that's probably your greatest leadership trait, I think the more comfortable your leadership journey will be. So.
Thank you very much. So there's a microphone in the back. I can also hand this microphone to anyone who wants to speak.
My name's Amanda Fitzgibbons. I'm a senior here at Agnes Scott. Nice to meet you. I was honored to see you come and speak today. I have a question about, you mentioned about lifestyle diseases as a definite problem in the U.S., but we haven't really been addressing them the way that maybe we should be. We're addressing problems internationally. And so I wanted to ask you, something like AmeriCorps, like projects for grads to work a year or two service like the AmeriCorps program, and is that worth it? Is that short-term 1 to 2 year projects with Youth of America graduates like myself worth getting into to help solve problems that we're dealing with in America?
Yeah, I think all of those programs are incredibly useful. And we don't have, like many countries have, some sort of a mandatory service after college. And I think AmeriCorps, Teach for America, and those sorts of programs are starting in some ways to build that sense that, as opposed to feeling the necessity of going directly to graduate school or, directly into a career path, taking some time and just doing that kind of service, that sort of giving back. So I think those are incredible programs and a wonderful opportunity to be exposed to different parts of society than you might have been exposed to in your own life, or, it's a way of giving back. So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Storm Harvey. I'm a first year here at Agnes Scott, and I just had a question. I know we went over a lot of projects that worked, and I was curious about a project that didn't work, that you were able to turn around and make it work, because I know in our book that we read, Half the Sky, they talked about how, especially in agriculture, they introduced a new form of seed, and the women were growing the seed, but the crop became a cash crop, and then the men took over. And so I was wondering kind of what you do in that kind of situation.
Yeah, and we have some 997, if I'm right, close to 1,000 projects that are ongoing, in any given year. So it's hard for me to talk about a particular project. But, I think that there are categories of things that we know don't always work, and there's a whole range of things. One program that we deliberately got out of was a program around monetized food aid. And it was a huge program that had been around for 50, 60 years, where surplus crops from the United States were shipped over to developing countries and then turned into cash to spend for development programs. And it was a program that may have worked at a time when we had huge farm surpluses, but it became very, very expensive, very burdensome, and was clear that after a while what it was doing was basically flooding local markets with U.S. crops and depressing the markets in those countries. And as I said earlier, most of the countries in which we work, agriculture is their main economic source of income. And so we actually phased out of doing those programs at a huge consequence for our organization. That was somewhere between $50 to $100 million a year for us to be part of that monetization program, but we opted out of it. And that was, again, one of those things that was coming on just as I was coming on to CARE. And with a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of advocacy with the U.S. government, we've been able to change that policy so that the U.S. government is phasing out of that whole program of monetization. So it's one of the big areas of work that didn't work, wasn't good for the people that we were talking about. Had huge short-term benefit because it was a huge, huge source of funding for us, but one that we thought was not in the long-term interest of the people we served. And luckily, as a result of kind of persistence, that policy has been able to change and turn around. So that's just one example. But there are lots of things like that on the individual level that, one of the things that we hope that we're getting better at is, as we say, fail fast. Do something, figure out what's not working, and if it's not working, stop it and move on to something else.
Hi, I'm Anastasia McCrae. I'm a sophomore, and I had a question about how do you keep people interested in topics that are global, like are affecting our country as well as other countries, but people might just think like, oh, it's someone else's country. Like I know in my maternal and reproductive health class with Dr. Patterson, we talked about how maternal health in the US is getting worse. But people don't think of maternal health as an issue in the US as much as it is an issue in, say, like an African nation.
I wish I had an answer. It is very challenging to be an international organization and keep people's interest in issues that they feel are issues that happen over there. And one of the areas we do a lot of work in is disaster and humanitarian assistance. And it's interesting, if there is an earthquake or a flood, resources come in, overnight. We just had the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and we were able to raise resources very, very rapidly. People, when they see a disaster strike, there is a huge outpouring of sympathy. The Haiti earthquake is another example where there was huge amount of outpouring and people were very interested in that. On the other hand, we have one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world occurring in Syria. And people, shut off when it's an issue around conflict. And I think there is a very different feeling that people have when there's a natural disaster. There's a sense, well, people didn't deserve it. It's not their fault. This is just something that happened. But when it is conflict, I think there's a very different feeling. South Sudan is another issue that we're very deeply involved with. The Congo, you can name, conflict after conflict, and people just don't get as inspired. We're about to go through the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopia, and that area is about to go through what happens, unfortunately, far too often, drought and then a famine. And I think people get burned out on these issues, and it's very hard to keep public's attention on things that are cyclical or that have to do with conflict. On the other hand, when there are things that are catastrophic and kind of a one-time issue, I think people do feel more greater connection to it. So it's something that we deal with all the time, and it'd be interesting to see what you all think. What are the best ways of getting people to think about it. I think your generation thinks a lot more globally, and I do think that your generation thinks a lot less about, it is us or them, and I think recognize that we are part of a global community. And I think it's that kind of awareness that something that happens over there may affect us over here, and after all, if we're really part of one human family, and it's kind of accident of birth that puts you here in this country and somebody else in another country, I think there is a greater sense of that global commitment. But it's a challenge.
Hi, my name's Helene, and I was kind of wondering, I know you were talking a little bit about how CARE's focus has changed over its long history, and it mentions a little bit in this little blurb that it's also deepening the connections between poverty and the environment. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that, the environmental change and public health and poverty.
Yeah. So we're very much involved in it in a variety of ways. I mean, first of all, when you think about what's happening in terms of the erosion of the environment, oftentimes it's happening in poor countries. And many people in many of the communities that we work with, whether it's coastal areas where people make their living from fishing and overfish and end up, having an impact on the fisheries. People who live off of the land and use lumber for fuel for cooking and end up deforestation. So, one of the things that we're working on is how do we help people who are living off the land understand how to value the environment and how to be economically continue to have economic livelihood that may be based off of living off the land, but do it in a way that is environmentally sound. The other way is, clearly the impact of climate change is having a huge impact on the populations that we work in. And so, while we recognize the impact of climate change here in this country and what it's doing to our weather patterns, in many of the countries that we work in, it's catastrophic. The increase in cyclones, the increase in drought, the change in patterns such that people are no longer able to regularly predict what farming environments are. So, we're doing a lot of work in how do we make sure that the communities that we work in are able to adapt to climate change and climate change impact, but also how can we help people who live off the land to do that in a way that's environmentally sustainable. Give an example of adaptation in places where people, and this is a kind of a project we were involved in Bangladesh, where a lot of people who live on coastal areas are having more and more frequent cyclones. And in many of the populations that we work in, poultry farming is a big source of income. We were able to work in a lot of the work that we do. We go to communities and really look at, what are the kind of solutions that are simple but help them to adapt to changing environments. And so in this one community where they were raising chickens, we switched them to raising ducks instead that also give poultry and all the rest, but ducks float, chickens sink. So, we were able to shift and, to duck farming as opposed to chicken farming. And it was a pretty, it was simple, but, chickens, when you have cyclones, die, ducks float. So, there's simple things like that.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Mahadir, and I'm a current senior at Agnes Scott. I'm a public health and anthro-social double major. So this is a big topic in my public health and anthro classes, and I'm just curious to know how CARE intervenes how CARE intervenes in communities where the intervention may conflict with the culture present, like child marriage, and if so, how does CARE impact these communities without offending or imposing on the culture?
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's a big issue because a lot of things that we work on, particularly around girls and women sometimes are challenging and difficult issues to work with in communities where gender norms are very different and there are harmful traditional practices. Part of it is that our workforce comes from the countries in which we work. If you go to a care office, it's not a bunch of Americans. If you go to care in Ethiopia, it's Ethiopians. If you go to care in Peru, it's Peruvians. So our staff very much reflect the communities in which we work, and I think that's a huge plus, because those people are, the people who work for us are able to understand communities and to work with communities and to understand how to bridge community norms and how to really help to shift those norms. So, even with some of the most challenging and difficult issues, and I'll take one from a project in Ethiopia, one of the most sensitive issues, female genital cutting. And a project that we were working with, this young Ethiopian woman, very courageous, who had herself been able to convince her father and elders to not be subjugated to that practice, took on a project to actually educate the community around that. And one of the things that she did, this is a very private practice that is, usually women only. She actually took a video and then showed that to the men in the community. They had no idea really how brutal and how damaging this was to the girls in their village. And after they saw it, the men themselves took this on and said, we're going to rid the community of this practice. But it was because she was from the community, was trusted, that she was able to do this and to then get the men who, in many places are the ones who continued to perpetuate practices that aren't in the best interest of women, and they then became the biggest champions. Another project that I can think of that I went to in Bangladesh, which was a gender-based violence program, and this was a program where women were routinely beaten, because the seconds on the clock weren't right, or whatever. I mean, it was just the practice that went on. And by working with men in the community again, they became the champions. Men who recognized that, who had, their fathers had been engaged, had practiced gender-based violence. It's what they grew up with. It's what they knew. But by starting to work with them on, simple things like, all right, if you beat your wife, do you get a better response or a worse response? Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really lead to the result that I wanted. And they became champions for setting up a surveillance system that looked at and monitored and policed incidents of domestic, what we would say domestic violence in the home, and totally shifted the peer norms. And it was when those men started talking to other men that the rates of gender-based violence plummeted. I couldn't have done that, another woman couldn't have done that, but it was men talking to men who recognized that, in fact, this wasn't in our best interest. And there are ways of negotiating differences that don't have to include violence. And by the way, I don't get a better result when I beat my wife. And our household is happier, we have a better family life, and all those things that are positive. And so they were the ones who started shifting what happened, because it was men who spoke up for making those changes. So I think it's by working with communities themselves and looking at ways in which you can engage people who are then able to shift those norms, that we've been able to take on very challenging and very difficult and sensitive issues.
Well, Helene, I think I'd like to ask a final question, if I may. I loved what you said. You said so many wise things about leadership. And, at the heart of what you said was this notion of being your authentic self. And I think that's so important for young people to hear. I'd love to get your advice as we begin this effort at Agnes Scott to infuse leadership development across the curriculum. And so I guess my question is whether you think of it as are there things you wish you had learned in college that would have prepared you better for the leadership journey that you have? Or as you look for, the people you want to hire, the people you see as change agents at CARE or in the global health movement, what do you wish people taught in college? And specifically, what advice do you have for Agnes Scott as we seek to infuse leadership development across our college experience?
Yeah, I think they're not things that I would say you could specifically teach as like in the sense of a course. I just think it's exposing people to broad range of experiences. One of the things that I get the most frustrated about when I talk to young people is this notion that there is a particular path. And I just think the more you're willing to take risk, the more you're willing to do what's not necessarily expected. I think that's what helps build your leadership journey, is the ability to have wide range of experiences and take advantage of things that may be, unpredictable. So, I don't know how you teach that, but I think the opportunity to have different experiences, when I think back on the things that I think really helped me the most as I went along, it was getting involved in things that had nothing to do with school. So, I was on every student government, whatever. I was in every community health drive. I was, I raised my hand and volunteered to do just about anything that people asked me to do. You wanted somebody to, set up a party. You wanted somebody to, volunteer to pick up people after church or whatever. I mean, I think it is being willing to be out there and do things. And I'm a big proponent of getting involved in communities. There's so much in this Atlanta community that whether it's volunteering for a food bank or, voter registration drive, I think those are the kinds of things. We're so focused on, are we going to, get excellence in our course curriculum? Well, all of you, you put the work, that's one of those effort in, it's a linear equation. You study, you get the, if it's a hard course, you get extra help on it, you're going to do well. I mean, most people are going to be able to be pretty academically successful if you put the effort in. But I think what people don't put the effort in is building a holistic sense of themselves as people. And so, get out there, get involved with communities, do some things that get out of your comfort zone, get off the campus, do internships in organizations, take a semester in another college, all those things that I think give you the opportunity to round out your experience while you're continuing to study and get A's and B's and, be excellent in your work. And also think about what are the things that you really want to spend academically, what do you really care about? Because I also, I know everybody wants to be on Dean's List and everybody wants to be, but there's some things that maybe it doesn't matter if you don't do quite as well, because that's not where you want to put your emphasis, and you spend more time doing things in the community. So I think it is that being willing to think broadly about, rounding out other experiences and taking some risk and doing some things that are outside of just, the linear path.
That is great advice and a great note.
Don't tell anybody that I said don't get A's and everything. That's not what you're supposed to say when you come. But
I loved what you said about failing fast.
Yeah,
too.
right.
I think that's it's a part of the college journey, is to figure out also the things where this is not for me, and that's a really good personal victory to know, to learn that as well. So thank you. That's such extraordinary wisdom that you've shared with us today, Helene. We're so grateful to you. I think that for all the students in this room, and as I look at all these students, and I think about how special it is to hear from a seasoned leader so much truth and frank wisdom about organizational leadership, about personal leadership, about being an authentic leader in the world. And I am excited about what the students in this room will go on to do in their own leadership journey. So thank you for your the amazing example that you've set. Thank you for sharing of yourself so generously, Helene. Thank you, Amy, for being such a wonderful interviewer. I want to thank the Huberts for making this possible, and all of you for joining us this afternoon. So let's just please thank Dr. Gayle and Dr. Patterson.